Everyone laughed when the rich heiress mocked the black waiter, until he replied in Chinese. The crystal chandeliers sparkled above the crowded dining hall, but all eyes turned to the corner table where a sharp voice cut through the air. Vivian. Cross, one of the most feared billionaires in the city, leaned back in her velvet chair, her laughter echoing like glass shattering. "Look at this man," she sneered, gesturing toward the waiter standing stiffly by her side. "He cannot even hold a tray straight. How do people like him end up in a place like this?" The guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to speak. Daniel Reed, the waiter she mocked, kept his eyes low, his hands steady despite the storm of humiliation pressing down on him. To everyone else, he looked like an ordinary man in a plain uniform. But there was something in the way he stood, calm, unshaken, that did not quite fit the image Vivian painted. Her words grew sharper, dripping, with cruelty, as if breaking him publicly gave her power. Yet Daniel's silence was not weakness. It was patience. A silence that carried weight, as though he knew something she, and the rest of the glittering crowd, did not. And that was the truth no one in the room expected. Daniel Reed was not who they thought he was, a small wooden box, and searched for work that would at least allow him to stand on his own feet. That search led him to a restaurant. Hardly the grand halls he once walked, but honest labor where he could rebuild with dignity. The first day he tied the apron around his waist, whispers had followed him. Some staff recognized him, though they never dared to ask why a man who once shook hands with presidents now carried trays. Daniel never confirmed or denied anything. He simply nodded, learned the menu, and began again. But not everyone left him in peace. Vivian Cross noticed him almost immediately. To her, he was a curiosity, an opportunity to sharpen her tongue at someone she thought could not defend himself. She was wealthy beyond measure, born into privilege she never earned, and she made sure the world never forgot it. 8 months had passed since Daniel started, and in those months, Vivian had never wasted a chance to ridicule him. It began with subtle remarks. "Do you even know how to pour wine correctly?" Then, sharper barbs. "A man like you is fit for nothing but clearing plates." She spoke loudly enough for other diners to hear, ensuring the humiliation spread. The waitstaff winced. The manager forced polite smiles, and Daniel endured it all with the kind of patience that few could understand. For Daniel, silence was not weakness. Every insult from Vivian was measured, remembered, and written down. When his shifts ended, he would return to his modest apartment and record her words in a leather-bound journal. It was not revenge he sought, but truth. He wanted a record of who she was, a record that one day might matter. Still, the cruelty wore him down. There were nights when he stared at his reflection, wondering how far he had fallen. The diplomat who once mediated disputes between nations was now mocked by a single arrogant woman across a dinner table. Yet he never let bitterness devour him. He reminded himself that dignity was not lost in titles, but in choices. His choice was to keep moving forward, no matter how small the steps. Vivian, however, grew bolder with each passing week. She believed she had stripped him of any pride, that her wealth made her untouchable. She would lean back in her chair, jewelry glittering under the chandeliers, and make her cruelty into a spectacle. To her, Daniel was just another servant in a world built for her amusement. What she never realized was that the man she mocked spoke fluent Arabic, Mandarin, French, and Russian. What she never realized was that ambassadors once waited for his counsel and generals trusted his judgment. Vivian saw only the apron, never the man who wore it. The other staff sometimes asked why he never reported her, why he let the abuse continue. Daniel would only reply with a faint smile. Some truths reveal themselves in time. His colleagues did not fully understand, but they respected his composure. They watched him carry himself with a kind of discipline that no insult could shatter. The open question remained, How long could a man endure such humiliation before fate placed him back where he truly belonged? The quiet dignity that Daniel carried was not the posture of a broken man. It was the silence before a storm. The restaurant buzzed with its usual Friday night energy, waiters moving quickly between tables while music played softly in the background. At one corner, a group of foreign dignitaries arrived, their presence instantly changing the atmosphere. They were high-profile clients from Asia, men and women who spoke in low tones of Mandarin, their words flowing smoothly like water. Daniel Reed stood ready, holding his notepad, prepared to serve them. Vivian Cross, seated at her usual table, noticed the clients as well. Her sharp eyes followed Daniel as he approached them. For months, she had used him as her personal target, but tonight she saw an opportunity. With important guests in the room, she could make the humiliation sting even deeper. Her voice rang out across the polished floor before Daniel could even speak. "Do not bother trying to understand them, waiter," she said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "You cannot even pronounce the names on the menu properly, let alone speak Mandarin." Laughter followed from a few of her companions. Heads turned, including the clients, who paused mid-conversation. Daniel kept his eyes down, his jaw tightening for only a second. He had been insulted countless times before, but this moment was different. Vivian had not only embarrassed him, but had also used his supposed ignorance to impress others. For the first time in 8 months, he allowed himself a single response. As he placed the menu in front of one of the foreign guests, he spoke softly, yet clearly in flawless Mandarin, introducing the chef's specials with precise tones. The room froze. Every syllable carried the weight of practice, knowledge, and lived experience. The dignitary's eyes widened in surprise, then lit up with respect. One of them even nodded slightly, recognizing the fluency. Vivian's painted smile faltered. Her hand tightened around her glass as though she had misheard. "What was that?" she snapped, trying to regain control. But Daniel only bowed slightly and stepped back, leaving the impression to linger. The guests exchanged quiet words in Mandarin, some smiling in appreciation. They returned their attention to Daniel when he came back to serve wine, speaking to him politely in their own language. Daniel responded in short phrases, never revealing too much, but enough to show that he understood every word. The restaurant staff exchanged glances. Many of them had endured Vivian's cutting remarks, yet none had expected this quiet waiter to reveal such a skill. Something about the way Daniel carried himself in that moment hinted at a past far greater than his current position. Vivian, however, refused to yield. "So the waiter learned a few phrases," she said loudly, trying to dismiss the moment. "It means nothing." But her words no longer carried the same weight. The dignitaries were clearly impressed, and even her companions looked less convinced by her mockery. Daniel walked back into the kitchen, his hands steady, but his heart racing. He had not planned to reveal his skill tonight, yet Vivian had forced his hand. The small display was enough to shake her confidence, but he knew it was only the beginning. Behind the kitchen doors, Daniel pulled out his phone and checked the recordings he had been keeping. Every insult, every humiliation, every moment of cruelty from Vivian Cross was stored carefully. He had endured for months not because he was powerless, but because patience was his greatest weapon. This night marked the turning point. Her attempt to destroy his dignity in front of foreign clients had only exposed a glimpse of his hidden strength. For the first time in months, Daniel felt the balance shifting. When he returned to the dining floor, Vivian avoided his eyes. Her usual confidence had cracked, though she tried to mask it with forced laughter. The guests still addressed him respectfully, ignoring her attempts to reclaim the stage. Daniel's silence spoke louder than any insult she could ever throw. For the first time, she was the one unsettled, and he knew it would not stop here. Quietly, he resolved that the time had come to prepare for what was next. He would gather every recording, every piece of evidence, and when the right moment arrived, the truth about who he truly was would no longer remain in the shadows. The game had shifted, and Vivian Cross had no idea how close she stood to losing everything. Vivian Wellington walked into the restaurant each evening like she was entering her own palace. Her heels struck the marble floor in sharp rhythm, and her voice carried across the room before anyone could even see her. The staff had grown used to her arrogance, but that did not make it easier. For Daniel, it became a test of patience every single day. She would glance at him with that same mocking smile, as if she was surprised he was still there. "Oh, the waiter with the old suit again," she said one night, not caring that the other staff could hear. "Tell me, Daniel, does serving tables feel like an achievement to you, or is it the highest honor you will ever receive?" Daniel lowered his eyes, steady as stone. He placed her wine glass gently before her and gave no reply. To the casual observer, it looked like submission. But inside, his silence was not weakness. It was control. Each insult she threw became another entry in the recordings he had kept hidden. Her comments grew bolder. Vivian began to lace her mockery with race, wealth, and status. "You know," she said once while laughing with her friends, "men like him should be grateful to even stand near people like us. He should thank us for giving him purpose." Her words burned, not only for Daniel, but for every staff member forced to hear them. Yet he never snapped, never argued. At night, Daniel would go home to his small apartment, set his phone on the table, and review the recordings. Each file carried her laughter, her sharp tone, her arrogance. He labeled them carefully, storing them in order. It was his quiet war, fought not with anger, but with patience. Still, Vivian did not slow down. Her arrogance thrived on his silence. She mistook his calm for fear. She told others he was too simple to fight back. She told the younger waiters to look at Daniel as an example of what happens when a man fails in life. She laughed that he had grown old carrying trays instead of influence. The staff pitied him, but they could not risk speaking out. Vivian's family had money, power, and connections. Anyone who crossed her often found their job gone within weeks. And so the restaurant lived in a silent prison of her insults, while Daniel alone carried the weight with unshaken dignity. Yet behind the calm mask, his preparation continued. He began collecting not only recordings, but also documents from his past. Old speeches, photographs with global leaders, articles written about him when he was still respected. He dug out the old leather briefcase that once traveled with him across embassies. Every night, he placed one more piece of his former life inside it, as if preparing for a return that no one expected. The tension grew sharper. Vivian's mockery became louder, more cruel. She enjoyed the attention she got from humiliating him. One evening, she forced him to repeat her order 3 times, pretending he was too uneducated to understand her accent. When he brought the dishes, she sighed loudly and said to the entire table, "This man cannot even carry a tray with grace. Imagine if he ever had a real responsibility. Disaster!" The room went quiet, staff exchanging uneasy glances, guests whispering. But Daniel only bowed slightly and walked away. Inside, his patience was stretched to its limit. The time was coming. There was an invisible line forming between them. On one side stood Vivian, drunk on power, convinced she was untouchable. On the other side stood Daniel, calm but armed with truth, slowly tightening his grip on the evidence he would one day unleash. Suspense grew thicker each night. Every insult she hurled was a question. Would this be the one that broke him? But Daniel's strength was in restraint. He knew the greater the humiliation, the greater the moment of reversal would be. Vivian could not see it, but she was fueling her own downfall. Every word, every laugh, every cruel comment became another stone in the wall of evidence that Daniel was quietly building. And though she laughed now, the day was approaching when laughter would no longer be hers. The night. That changed everything. Started like any other evening at the restaurant. The air was thick with the smell of roasted garlic and butter, glasses clinking as waiters rushed from table to table. Daniel moved quietly, carrying plates with calm precision. He had learned to blend into the background, to become almost invisible, while silently holding on to the truth of who he once was. But tonight was not just another night. Vivian had brought a group of international investors to the restaurant. They were the kind of people she desperately wanted to impress. Men in sharp suits and women in elegant dresses, their voices carrying accents from around the world. These investors were her future, her ticket to expanding her business beyond borders. And Vivian, as always, was hungry for their admiration. She spotted Daniel almost immediately. He was refilling glasses of water near their table, his head slightly bowed, his expression calm. To Vivian, his presence was the perfect tool for her usual display of arrogance. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with mockery. "Look at him," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "He has been working here for months, and I doubt he even understands the simplest words outside of English. Imagine trusting someone like him with anything important." The investors chuckled politely, unsure of how to respond. Vivian, sensing their hesitation, pressed further. "Daniel," she said sharply, snapping her fingers like he was a servant. "Tell me, do you even know what these gentlemen are talking about? They are discussing real business, something far beyond your understanding." Daniel froze for a brief second, his hand still resting on the jug of water. Inside, his heart beat harder than it had in years. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. For months he had endured her humiliation, her insults, her belief that he was beneath her. He had waited patiently, recording every word, every cruel laugh, every moment she tried to strip away his dignity. He looked up slowly, meeting her eyes. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made the entire table go silent. "Actually, Vivian," Daniel said softly, "I understood everything." For a moment, confusion flashed across her face. Then, before she could speak, Daniel turned to the investors. In flawless Mandarin, he began addressing them directly. His tone was smooth, confident, and natural, as if the language had lived inside him his whole life. The investors froze, their eyes widening in shock. One of them leaned forward, responding to him quickly in Mandarin. Daniel answered back without hesitation, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Vivian's smile vanished, her face drained of color as she looked between them, unable to follow a single word. She had mocked him countless times, calling him uneducated, calling him unworthy, and now, in front of her most important guests, he revealed a truth she could not deny. But Daniel was not finished. He switched languages seamlessly, addressing another investor in French, then another in Arabic. His words flowed like music, his confidence filling the room. Every person at the table was stunned, their admiration clear in their eyes. And then came the final blow. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With steady hands, he placed it on the table and pressed play. Vivian's voice filled the air, her insults sharp, cruel, undeniable. The recordings played one after another, her mocking his job, laughing at his appearance, making degrading remarks about his worth. Her arrogance, her prejudice, her cruelty, all exposed in crystal clarity. The investors leaned back, their expressions turning cold. The admiration they once held for Vivian was gone, replaced by disgust. One by one, they stood up from the table. Without a word to her, they gathered their belongings and walked out of the restaurant. Vivian jumped to her feet, panic flashing across her face. "Wait, please, this is a misunderstanding," she shouted after them. But no one turned back. The sound of the door closing behind them echoed through the restaurant like a final judgment. The room fell silent. Every waiter, every diner, every staff member had stopped what they were doing. All eyes were on Daniel, the quiet man who had just revealed himself to be far more than anyone had imagined. Vivian stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her empire, her contracts, her carefully built image, all of it had collapsed in a single evening. And it was not because of bad business or poor planning. It was because of her own arrogance, her own cruelty, her own refusal to see the worth of the man standing before her. Daniel looked at her one last time, his expression calm but firm. He did not raise his voice. He did not insult her. He simply said, "Respect is something you cannot fake. You either give it or you lose everything." With that, he walked away, leaving Vivian trembling in the ruins of her own pride. The restaurant remained in stunned silence. Then, slowly, the sound of whispered voices began to spread. Some spoke of admiration, some of disbelief, but all agreed on one thing. No one would ever forget the night Daniel revealed who he truly was. The night at the restaurant was only the beginning. Within hours, whispers of what had happened started spreading like wildfire. A diner had filmed the entire scene, Vivian's cruel insults, her loud laughter, and then Daniel's calm, stunning revelation in multiple languages. By morning, the video was everywhere. On social media, it had millions of views. News outlets picked it up, calling it the waiter who silenced arrogance in 3 languages. Daniel Carter, once invisible in the very city he had served with, pride, suddenly became a name on everyone's lips. Old colleagues began reaching out. Men and women who had once worked beside him in diplomatic missions wrote messages of respect and admiration. Some even admitted that seeing him treated so poorly had hurt them deeply. But now, watching him rise with dignity filled them with pride. Soon, government officials contacted him. They knew his value, his record, his skill. Daniel was offered a reinstatement, not just into his old position, but into an even higher diplomatic role. His patience and humility had shown the world the true strength of character. Where Vivian had tried to strip him of dignity, Daniel's quiet endurance had built a platform that no insult could destroy. Meanwhile, Vivian Montclair's world collapsed. The investors she had tried so hard to impress canceled every deal. They refused to work with someone so openly arrogant and disrespectful. International business circles, once her playground, now shut their doors on her. She tried to fight back, issuing statements, blaming Daniel, even accusing the media of twisting the story. But the recordings were too clear, her words too sharp. There was no defense, her reputation was gone. The woman who once strutted into restaurants with pride now slipped out of airports with sunglasses pulled low, hoping no one would recognize her. In a matter of weeks, Vivian was forced to leave the country, disgraced and humiliated. Daniel, on the other hand, returned to the life he was meant to live. He walked into embassies not as a servant, but as a respected diplomat once again. This time, however, he carried with him something even greater than titles or honors. He carried a story that had touched millions, a reminder that arrogance is a fragile crown, and dignity is a shield no one can take away. Where Vivian had sought power through humiliation, Daniel had found strength in patience. Where she had tried to lift herself by pushing others down, she had fallen into her own trap. And Daniel, the man everyone overlooked, had risen higher than anyone could have imagined. The moral was clear, written in the headlines, spoken in homes, and shared across cultures. Arrogance destroys, but dignity endures. And Daniel Carter, once a quiet waiter mocked for his silence, now stood tall as living proof. Weeks later, the restaurant looked the same on the outside. Golden lights, polished glass doors, the smell of spices drifting into the street. But inside, everything had changed. The whispers were no longer about Vivian's power or charm. They were about her fall, and the man who had stood so quietly among them, carrying a secret no one could imagine. That evening, Daniel stepped inside, not in the uniform of a waiter, but in a dark tailored suit, his diplomatic badge resting neatly in his pocket. The room fell silent as soon as he walked in. Every head turned, every whisper hushed. The staff who once brushed past him now stood straighter, offering respectful nods. A manager rushed forward, pulling out a chair at one of the finest tables. "Ambassador Daniel, this way, please," he said, his voice careful, almost reverent. Daniel sat down quietly. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to remind them of what had happened. His presence alone was enough. Plates of the finest dishes were brought to his table, but more than the food, it was the respect in the air that filled the room. He looked around, remembering the nights he had been insulted, laughed at, treated as less than human. Now those same walls seemed to honor him in silence. When the meal was over, Daniel stood, thanked the staff warmly, and walked out into the night. On his face was not the grin of revenge, but a quiet, knowing smile. Because in the end, he had proven something deeper than any contract or fortune could ever prove. Money can buy power, but it can never buy true respect. That, Daniel knew, comes only from character.